Today's video is a collection of 5 fan favorite stories that all sound like they're straight out of a fiction novel, but they're not. All these stories actually happened. Now, these 5 fan favorites have all been completely re-edited for today's episode, so even if you may have heard or seen one or all of them before, this will still feel like a brand new viewing experience. And for all you longtime fans of the channel, make sure you pay extra close attention to find that secret image in one of these stories. The first person to find the secret image and comment what it is and the timestamp of where it appears in the comment section, I will pin your comment to the top of the comment section. Also, Ol Lungy is back again, so make sure you comment your favorite fact he shares in today's video. But before we get into today's 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, on the like button's birthday, make sure to mail them a birthday card. But ensure you first booby trap it with fart spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's 5 stories. The Tromp family were by all accounts a normal, hard-working household. 51-year-old Mark Tromp and his wife, 53-year-old Kobe Tromp, had established a successful red currant farm and earth-moving business at their property in Sylvan, which is just outside of Melbourne. Their 3 adult children, which were 29-year-old Rihanna, 25-year-old Mitchell, and 22-year-old Ella, all lived and worked with them at the farm. But their seemingly ordinary lives would change forever on Monday, August 29th, 2016. That day, without any warning, the family dumped their passports, credit cards, and cell phones on the kitchen table and ran out the front door, leaving it unlocked. They hopped into Ella's car and drove north. 30 kilometers into their journey, and it was discovered that the son, Mitchell, still had his phone, and so the others yelled at him to throw it out the window, and so he did. He chucked his phone out the window. The family drove all day and night until they reached a motel in the New South Wales town of Bathurst, 800 kilometers away to the west of Sydney. The following morning, Mitchell decided he did not want to be a part of whatever it was they were doing, and so he abandoned his family and began heading home. The remaining 4 family members did not go after Mitchell. Instead, they just piled back in the car and drove east to a popular tourist destination called the Jennelin Caves. It was there that the 2 daughters, Rihanna and Ella, decided that they also did not want to be a part of whatever it was they were doing, and so they snuck away from their parents and stole a car and began heading home. The parents, after realizing their daughters had now left, did nothing. They did not go after them. The 2 sisters drove south to the town of Goulburn, where they called the police to report their parents missing. The story made its way into the media, where the family was initially ridiculed for getting lost in the first place and getting completely separated in an area they should know well. This is their country. It's not a remote area. They were near big established towns the entire time. It just didn't make sense. But when police went to the Tromp family farm back in Sylvan and they discovered the front door was unlocked, there were credit cards, passports, and phones on the table, suddenly it seemed like there was a lot more to this case than met the eye. And so as this strangeness came into focus in the media, people stopped ridiculing the family and began speculating what caused them to suddenly flee their house. Was it something in the water they were drinking? Was there chemicals on the farm that was screwing up their brain? Were they running from someone? Were they in debt? What was it that caused this strange sudden departure? Back in Goulburn, after reporting their parents missing, Rihanna and Ella inexplicably separated at a gas station. Rihanna just climbed in the back of some utility truck, and Ella hopped in the stolen vehicle and started driving home. Later that night, Ella would become the first Tromp family member to be located by police when she arrived at the farm and police were waiting for her there. Mitchell would arrive back home the following morning after taking a series of trains to get there. Once Mitchell and Ella were reunited, they made a statement to the media outside of the family farm, and as you're looking at them, it's clear they're totally shell-shocked. They don't know what's happened, and they're trying to articulate why their family family left in the first place and what they were doing and where they're going. And the best they could do was to say, well, there was a lot of pressure on our family and it was building up, and these things are just difficult to explain, and I don't really know what we were doing. Mitchell would say that there was a belief that people were after them. There was some paranoia there, but that paranoia was predominantly held by their parents. While Mitchell and Ella were certainly in a state of shock, they did seem mentally stable. The same could not be said for their sister, Rihanna. She was discovered by the driver of the truck she had snuck into after he had driven over an hour away. He had pulled over to check on something. He had gone around the back and then had the life scared out of him when he saw Rihanna just sitting there in a what he called catatonic state. She didn't know her name. She didn't know where she was just sitting there. Rihanna was taken to the Goulburn Hospital where she was put into their psychiatric unit. As media interest grew, the parents, Mark and Kobe, got back in their car up at the Jenolan Caves and drove south towards Melbourne. A day later, on Wednesday, the pair had driven 600 kilometers to the Victorian town of Wangaratta, where they too inexplicably separated. Kobe turned around and started heading north again by means which are still a mystery, and a day later was found 350 kilometers away in the town of Yass in a very agitated state. She was taken to a hospital there, but then transferred to the Goulburn psychiatric unit to be with her daughter, Rihanna. Mark stayed in Wangaratta, and he was there for several days, and during his time there, he was spotted by a young couple really aggressively tailgating them, and then he was spotted again on another day fleeing from the car he had been driving. Finally, on Saturday evening, all of the Tromp family members were accounted for when Mark was finally discovered sitting next to the road near the Wangaratta airport. He was questioned by police and then assessed by a mental health officer, and then was released into the custody of his brother, who was a police officer. And as they drove away, Mark turned around and flipped off the photographers that had converged on the spot. He later released a more contrite statement, apologizing for the hurt and concern that were caused by these events, and he also paid respect to the police and the volunteers that went out looking for them. After the investigation, the police determined that nobody was chasing this family. They were not in any danger. The family had also not taken any drugs. They were not in debt. They were not involved in any sort of religious cult. And prior to this strange event, the family had no history of mental health issues. After the dust had settled and the Tromp family was just back at their farm going about their normal life, every media outlet wanted an interview with them to try to learn more about why this strange thing happened. But the family said, we're not doing interviews, we're not putting out any more statements, we just want to be left alone. And so as a result, all people could do was theorize. And the leading theory was that the Tromp family was suffering from something called folie à deux, which is a French term that means madness for two. And what happens is one person who is delusional can pass that delusion on to other people. And this typically only happens in very close-knit families or in very tight romantic relationships. While it's unclear which of the Tromps became psychotic first, doctors say it is clear at some point they were in a cycle of reinforcing each other's delusions if this folie à deux theory is the right one. While the full reasons for why the Tromps went on this strange voyage will probably never be known, the police deemed it a family matter and did not press charges. Richard Russell, better known as Bebo by his friends and family, was born in 1989 in Key West, Florida, but at the age of 7, he moved to Wasilla, Alaska. He was a standout athlete at Wasilla High School, competing in football and in track and field. After graduating in 2008, he moved to Coos Bay, Oregon, where he briefly attended a community college. While he was there, he met a woman named Hannah Strassner, and in 2011, they got married. And shortly after that, they opened a bakery that they would run together for 3 years. Hannah, who had gone to culinary school, was very detail-oriented and ran the show at the bakery. Bebo, on the other hand, was not professionally trained and was much more laid back and interested in experimenting with new and wild recipes. In 2015, with heavy hearts, they decided to sell the bakery so they could move to Seattle and be closer to Hannah's family. Once they arrived there, Bebo got a job at the SeaTac airport as a ground service agent for Horizons Airline. It was not a job he necessarily wanted, but they needed the cash. After working at Horizons Air for 4 years as a ramper, someone that moves the luggage in and out of the aircraft, Bibo was given some additional responsibility. They asked him to be on a 2-person tow team. A tow team is in charge of moving airplanes around in between their flights. And so the way this works is one person goes down and drives the actual tow vehicle and hooks that up to the airplane and begins moving it around, and the other person would go up into the cockpit, turn the plane on, and then work a couple of very basic systems to help get the plane to go where it needs to go. The members of a tow team are one of the very few number of people that are allowed to go into the cockpit of an aircraft by themselves. And so Bibo really relished this opportunity, and when he was up there, he found himself fascinated with all the controls, and any chance he got, he would ask a pilot, if they were inside of the aircraft, to teach him what some of these controls were. But one time, Bibo was flipping some of the switches in the cockpit that he was not supposed to touch, that other pilots had told him about, and the pilot of this particular plane caught him doing it, took exception to it, and reported him. But surprisingly, there were no repercussions. It was just really embarrassing for Bibo. Like many of the other ground service agents working at Horizon Airlines, Bibo was generally unhappy with his job. He felt like it was boring, that there wasn't much upward mobility, and that he was criminally underpaid. But there was one redeeming quality of his job, and that was, in virtue of working for an airline, he got all sorts of free airfare. And so not only did he get to fly for free all over the world, he got to fly basically anytime he wanted up to Alaska to visit his hometown and see his family, something that was very important to him. The people that knew Bibo said he had a great sense of humor, he was extremely friendly, and you could always catch him with his head buried in a book. And his coworkers would say he had aspirations to be an officer in the military. And when all those people that knew Bibo the best were asked, why do you think he did what he did on August 10th, 2018, none of them have an answer. On that fateful day, at 1:35 p.m. local time, a passenger airplane owned by Horizon Airlines flew into SeaTac Airport, where Bibo worked. And so this plane was not scheduled to fly for the rest of the day, so it was taxied to the far north section of the airport to a parking spot called Cargo 1. At 7:15 p.m. that evening, Bibo arrived at Cargo 1, and he climbed inside the empty aircraft and made his way into the cockpit. He followed the startup procedure until the plane was on and the propellers were starting to turn. He hopped out of the plane, got in his tow vehicle, and used it to turn the plane around so its nose was pointed towards the airfield. He moved the tow vehicle out of the way and then climbed back inside the aircraft, shut it behind him, and got in the cockpit and began taxiing out towards the runway. For the next few minutes, air traffic control bombarded Bibo over the radio, asking him, "What are you doing? This is unauthorized movement. You should not be heading towards the runway right now." But Bibo never responded. Instead, he just continued on until he reached the beginning of the runway, at which point, despite having no flight experience, minus some video games and fiddling with some switches in the cockpit while he was in the tow team, he managed to go full throttle and get this plane careening down the runway and successfully took off. But that was nothing compared to what he did next. Over the course of his 1-hour-long flight, he expertly performed backflips and barrel rolls and these huge loops in the sky, dangerous maneuvers that even expert pilots might risk stalling the plane and crashing. But he didn't. It was like he'd been doing this his whole life. Onlookers on the ground were shocked to see this passenger airline performing these ridiculous stunts so low to the ground that all over Seattle, you had people filming this plane and posting it to social media. So in real time, it was like the world was made aware of Bibo up in the sky. And so people went outside and just watched as he flew around. But the real story is not the aerial stunts that Bibo was pulling in the sky. It was the strange, calm conversation that Bibo had with the air traffic controller the whole time he was up in the sky. The extremely professional, very calm air traffic controller tries to convince Bibo that he really needs to come down and land this aircraft. And he begins telling him where he can go, different airfields, and if he needs to, he can land out in the Puget Sound. But Bibo kind of laughs it off and says, I wasn't really ever trying to land this plane. I just wanted to do a couple maneuvers before I put it down. And so as Bibo soared through the sky, this controller tries in vain to convince Bibo to stop what he's doing, and Bibo's just completely ignoring him and cracking jokes with him and telling him how he just loves the scenery up there and how beautiful it is. And then at one point, Bibo becomes remorseful, and he says to the controller that he really hopes he hasn't ruined his day, and he feels really bad for the people that he's inevitably going to hurt. And then in Bibo's most poignant moment, he tells the controller that he's just a broken guy, and he's got a couple of screws loose, and he didn't know it until now. Towards the end of the flight, Bibo tells the controller that he's going to try for one more barrel roll, and if it goes well, he's going to go nose down and call it a night. The controller tries to convince him that it's still possible to try to land, But at this point, Bebo's not listening. At 8:45 p.m., the nose of the plane was seen pointed straight down at the Earth. 1 minute later, at 8:46 p.m., Bebo intentionally crashed into a small island off the coast of Seattle. He was the only fatality in the crash. Here is a condensed version of some of the commentary between Bebo and the air traffic controller, along with some of the real footage of him flying the plane.
I just kind of want to do a couple maneuvers, see what it can do before I put her down, you know?
Approach welcome, final runway 16 right.
Welcome. Man, I'm a ground service agent. I don't know what that is.
There is the runway just off your right side in about a mile. Do you see that?
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to land it. I wasn't really planning on landing it. I got a lot of people that care about me, and it's going to disappoint them to hear that I did this. I would like to apologize to each and every one of them. Just a broken guy. Got a few screws loose, I guess. Never really knew it till now. Think I'm gonna try to do a barrel roll, and if that goes good, then I'll just go nose down and call it a night.
How Bebo was able to take off and fly around and pull these stunts without any formal training remains a mystery. Some people believe he was planning this for a long time, which is why whenever he was in the cockpit, when he was in the tow team, he would ask pilots to explain the different switches and toggles and how to use them, and he would feign that he was just curious, when in reality he was actually trying to learn how to fly the plane. As for the incredible stunts he was doing, it's believed he did learn those in a video game. But even if this is true, that he learned how to fly a plane by asking a couple questions and playing video games, the chances of it working out and actually successfully taking off and doing what he did are astronomically low. Normal people can't do that. And that's why the internet gave Bebo a new nickname to commemorate the fact that basically no one could have done this but him. And so they named him the Sky King. On the evening of June 24th, 1986, a 10-year-old boy named Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez bounced around in his seat and smashed his toy cars together in the cab of his father's big red tractor-trailer truck. Juan was so excited he could barely sit still. He always wanted to go for a ride in his dad's big truck. His dad was a long-haul trucker, but his dad always said no. But Juan had just gotten his best report card ever, and so as a reward for doing so well in school, Juan's father had surprised Juan and Juan's mom with this particular trip. Their plan was to drive from their hometown in southeastern Spain all the way across the country to the northern coast. And then once they got there, Juan's dad would offload the cargo that he had driven there. Juan and his mom and dad would stick around and kind of make a vacation out of it, going to the beaches and checking out the beautiful pastures where all the cows would graze. I mean, Juan was super excited. Juan's dad pulled the truck into this big lot with all these other trucks around, and then Juan's dad turned around and began backing the truck up so it could be paired up with the cargo he'd be hauling to the north coast. It was this huge 25,000-liter tanker that was covered in all these stickers and warning labels, and, Juan's father didn't know what this tanker actually contained, but he could tell, whatever it was pretty dangerous and also very important. And so as Juan's dad is backing up skillfully to line up with this tanker, Juan is just sitting in the back seat, absolutely transfixed at how cool his dad is. I mean, this is like the most amazing thing Juan had ever seen. And so finally, Juan's dad successfully hitched the truck to the tanker. And so once they were all hooked up, Juan's father yelled out the window and said bye to the people he worked with. And then Juan's father put in Juan's favorite tape cassette into the stereo and turned the music up. And then he turned onto the road and began making his way toward the highway. Juan's dad would drive basically all night, and Juan and his mother would basically sleep all night. But they would wake up at about 5 a.m. when Juan's father pulled into the parking lot of a diner that was located just north of the city of Madrid, Spain. They were making great time, so Juan's father told his family they could take their time eating. When the family did finish their meals, they got up and began walking out towards the truck, and little Juan, he turned around and he waved to the waitresses, and they all waved back. And then the family climbed back into Juan's father's truck, and then before long, Juan was curled up in the back seat trying to fall asleep again as his father merged onto the highway and began heading towards the stretch of mountain road called the Somosierra Mountain Pass. About 40 minutes later, a man who was also driving in the Somosierra Mountain Pass was just driving along when suddenly a huge red tractor-trailer truck came barreling toward him from behind, shining their lights into his car. And so this man, he sees this truck approaching so quickly, and he tried to get out of the way, but there was nowhere to go, and the truck wasn't stopping. It was honking its horn, and the truck smashed into this guy, which sent his car careening off the road, but luckily it did not tumble all the way down the mountain. And so this guy's car comes to a stop on the side of the road, and the guy, he kind of comes to, and he feels himself. He's worried he's got a serious injury. He did find a little blood on his head, but overall he felt he was okay. And then he managed to get his door open, and he climbed out of his car, and he looked a little ways down the road, and there was the truck that had hit him. It was now on its side, and it was hissing steam, and it didn't look like anybody inside the truck was trying to get out. Now, even though this guy was pretty shaken up from the crash he had just gotten into, he felt like he was definitely in better shape than whoever was in this truck, and so he decided he would just go up there and try to help them. But after only taking a few steps, this white van came blazing around the corner and came to a screeching stop on the road right next to where this guy was. And then before the guy could do anything, the sliding door to the van flung open, and this woman with blonde hair jumped out, and she ran over to him and she said, "I'm a nurse. Do you need any help?" And so this guy, he's looking at this woman and he's kind of sizing her up, and she did not seem like a nurse. And in fact, for some reason, this guy felt like she just made him really uncomfortable. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. And then he looked past this woman at the van, and he saw the driver looked oddly similar to the woman, except it was a man who was driving, but he also had very bright blonde hair, and he had these striking blue eyes that really stood out even from a distance. And then in the passenger seat of this van was this elderly woman who was just staring daggers at this guy who's now talking to this nurse who's right next to him. And so the guy's looking at the old woman, and the old woman's looking right back, and she really looked mean, like she was not happy to be talking to him. And so the guy finally just said to this woman who was claiming to be a nurse that, "You know what, I don't need any help. Go help them. They need help because they haven't gotten out of the truck yet." The woman just nodded, and then she ran back to the van, hopped inside, and the van sped, the 100 feet down the road to where the crashed big red tractor-trailer truck was. And again, the woman hopped out, and she rushed over to the truck, and she climbed on top of it, and she reached down, and she took something out of the truck. But from his perspective, 100 feet back, the guy who had also crashed, he couldn't tell what she had taken out of the cab. But after she took whatever she took, she climbed off the cab. She did not attempt to help anybody inside of the truck. She jumped back in the white van, and the white van sped off down the road, and they were gone. The guy barely had time to process what had just happened before he began to smell this unbelievably powerful rotten egg smell. When help arrived, emergency responders immediately realized they had an environmental disaster on their hands. The big red tractor-trailer truck, which was Juan's father's truck, was hauling 25,000 liters of sulfuric acid. And that rotten egg smell they were smelling in the area meant the air was now becoming toxic as the sulfuric acid leaked out and began interacting with the ground and making its way into the nearby river. So before anybody could even go inside of this truck to see if there were survivors, they had to basically cover it and the surrounding areas with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sand and lime to try to counteract the acid. It would take hours to do this, and in that time, nobody came out of the truck's cab. And then finally, when emergency crews were able to go up to the truck and look inside, they discovered that the vehicle's occupants were all dead. However, there were only two bodies. It was Juan's mother and father. Juan was nowhere to be found. Now, one of the theories was, well, when this crashed, maybe the sulfuric acid landed on Juan's body somehow and literally dissolved him, and so that's why he was not found. But that's not possible because it would take much, much longer for sulfuric acid to totally eat away someone's body. And the body would have to be fully submerged in the acid the entire time. So that could not have happened. Rescuers would search the entire area deep into the woods in all directions, looking for signs of this child, but there were none. And when investigators attempted to recreate this accident to try to figure out what actually caused it and why it happened, what they would learn would only confuse them more. Juan's father's truck had nothing wrong with it mechanically, meaning the brakes weren't messed up, the accelerator wasn't messed up. There really was no reason why this truck should have crashed unless it was intentional. That's the only way this could have happened. Also, the truck contains something called a tachometer, which registers every time the truck slows down or stops. And when investigators looked at the record from this tachometer, they discovered that Juan's father had slowed down or stopped 12 different times between leaving the diner and crashing. But the route from the diner to the crash site was a straight shot with no traffic lights or stop signs. Basically, there had been no reason from the diner to the crash site to ever slow down or stop. But again, Juan's father did 12 separate times. And then also there were traces of heroin that were found in a hidden compartment in Juan's father's truck. Now, Juan's parents had no criminal record and absolutely no connection to drugs or the cartel, but investigators did consider a theory that, perhaps a drug cartel ambushed Juan and his family, and ultimately Juan was kidnapped. But there was one more really strange element to Juan's disappearance, and that was that white van that guy saw right after the crash. Multiple people in the area around the Somosierra Mountain Pass said they saw that exact white van because they all remembered the woman and the man who had that same really bright blonde hair. It just was something that was kind of unique and stood out. But the police tried to track down this van and the man and the woman and the elderly woman who was also claimed to have been seen inside the van, but no trace of that van was ever found. And also, police were never able to figure out what that woman actually took from inside of Juan's father's cab before they sped off and disappeared. Missing person posters of Juan went up all over Spain, and almost immediately, loads of sightings were reported of Juan. But every time the police followed up on these sightings, they never panned out. Interpol, which is a major international police organization, called Juan's disappearance one of the strangest disappearances in all of Europe. 1 year after the crash, so in 1987, a driving instructor in Madrid, Spain, was filling out some paperwork in his office when he heard a knock on the door. When he answered the door, he found there was this elderly woman who appeared to be blind, and with her was a young boy who appeared to be about 11 years old. The driving instructor asked them, how can I help you? And he watched as the elderly woman turned and whispered something into the little boy's ear, and the driving instructor, he could hear her whispering, but he couldn't understand what she was saying. It sounded like a foreign language. And in fact, it would turn out they figured out she was speaking Farsi, which is the language spoken in Iran. The little boy listened to the elderly woman, and then after hearing what she had to say, he turned to the driving instructor and he asked in perfect Spanish, "Where's the US Embassy?" The instructor gave them directions, and then the little boy nodded, and then he and the elderly woman, they turned around, they grabbed each other's hands, and they began walking away. And as they walked away, the driving instructor, he just couldn't help but feel like there was something oddly familiar about these two people. And so he flagged them down and he said, "Come back for a second." And so the boy and the woman, they came back, and the driving instructor, he asked the boy, he said, "Do you live in Spain? And if you do, how long have you lived here for?" And when he asked the boy this, the boy immediately looked really afraid and just didn't say anything and kind of just stepped back like this, like he wasn't going to answer. And then the elderly woman, she turned and she whispered something else into the boy's ear. And then after she was done talking, the boy kind of settled down and he looked at the driving instructor and he said, 6 months. And for some reason, at this exact moment, the driving instructor realized why this boy seemed so familiar. He remembered seeing him on all those missing person posters all over the place. And so the driving instructor, he couldn't remember the boy's name. And he goes, "Hold on a minute." He turns and he runs inside of his office and he finds one of the posters that said Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez. He grabbed it and he ran back out to show it to them and be like, "Hey, they're looking for you." But when the driving instructor came back to the front door, the boy and the blind old woman were gone. And so the driving instructor, he stepped out, he's looking around, he's yelling out for them. They were gone. Now, it's important to understand that to this day, no sightings of Juan have ever been confirmed, and that includes the driving instructor who claimed to have seen Juan. But to this day, Juan's body has never been found, he's still missing, and his case is still unsolved. In 1887, 35-year-old Robert Ledru was a very talented detective working in Paris, France. He was so talented that periodically he would get called upon by other police departments around the country to help them solve their most difficult cases. And so that year, there was this coastal town in northern France that had this string of sailors that went missing, and nobody had the slightest idea what had happened to them. And so naturally, Robert was called in to investigate. The night Robert arrived in this town, it was very late and Robert was tired, so he went straight to his hotel and he went to bed. The following morning, he got up and he went straight to the local police department to meet the local officers that he would be working with on this investigation. But when he got there, he was told that the missing sailors case had been lowered in priority because during the night, a murder had been committed down on their beach. And so that was now their main focus. And so they apologized to Robert and said, I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing. But since you're here, do you want to help us in this beach murder investigation? And Robert said, sure. The victim was a middle-aged man named Andre Monet, who owned a dress shop in Paris, France. He had recently moved to this coastal town to enjoy the beautiful scenery. When his body was discovered early that morning, it was quickly determined he had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest, where the bullet actually went clear through him out the other side, but they hadn't found the bullet. There were no suspects, there were no leads, there was no clear motive. However, they were able to rule out robbery because there was still money in Andre's pockets. And so Robert and the other local officers left the police station and made their way down to the beach, where they began examining the area where Andre had been found. The local officers focused on looking for the bullet, while Robert decided to walk a little ways down the beach to see if there was any evidence that had been overlooked in the initial search. And after only walking a very short distance, Robert noticed some barely visible footprints that appeared to pass right by where Andre's body had been found. And these footprints, they continued past that area and then up a flight of stairs up onto the road where they disappeared. Robert called over the other officers and told them to make plaster casts of these footprints so he could analyze them. What that meant is the officers would literally just pour liquid plaster inside of these prints, and then when they dried, they would pull that plaster out, and it would literally be a 3D model of the foot that had made the prints. And so as the officers are working on these casts, Robert says to one of the officers that these prints looked really odd to him, like they were familiar in some way, but he just couldn't place where he had seen them before. Less than an hour later, when the plaster had dried, the officers pulled them out and they handed them to Robert, and as soon as Robert looked at them, he physically reacted to what he was seeing. It was like he was disappointed. And then without saying anything, he just walked down the beach with these plaster casts until he got to this secluded area where he sat down. And he sat there for hours and hours, just staring at the plaster casts, seemingly unaffected by the sun that was blazing down on him the whole time and the tide that was very quickly creeping up on him. The local officers who were watching this, they didn't know anything about Robert. All they knew is his reputation, which is he is this totally legendary detective, and so they didn't dare question his methods, even though this seemed really odd what he was doing. Finally, by mid-afternoon, Robert would put the cast down, he would stand up, and he would walk back over to the mystified local officers. And when he walked up to them, he would say, "There's no reason to stay at the beach any longer or interview any more witnesses. I think I've solved the case." But then instead of elaborating, he just turned around and walked up off the beach and headed back for his hotel. The local officers just looked at each other and shrugged, and they left too. Early the next day, the bullet that had killed Andre Monet was found on the beach. And so when Robert showed up to the beach, the chief of police handed him this bullet in an effort to help him continue the investigation. And as soon as Robert looked at it, he sighed and said, "Okay, now I know for sure what happened." And then Robert proceeded to break down the murder. He said the killer woke up in the middle of the night on the night that Andre was killed, and he got out of his bed, he put on his clothes, and then he headed down to the beach. There, he encountered Andre Monet, a man he didn't know who was most likely out for a midnight stroll as well. The two men struck up a friendly conversation, but at some point it turned into some sort of quarrel, at which point the killer drew his pistol, shot Andre in the chest, and then fled the scene. Robert told the local police chief that the reason he knew all these details is because he had been the killer. He killed Andre Monet. But he didn't do it on purpose, and he didn't remember, because he killed Andre Monet while he was sleepwalking. He told the chief when he was given those plaster casts of those footprints, he knew immediately why he thought those prints looked so familiar. Because as soon as he looked at the casts, he could tell whoever had made the prints was missing a toe, and as it happened, Robert was missing a toe. So those prints looked exactly like his footprints. And that morning, when he had woken up in his hotel room before even going down to the beach, he had noticed that his shoes and his socks, which were next to his bed, were sandy and damp. And he thought that was so strange because he couldn't remember how they got that way, but he was too busy to investigate. And that night, after he had sat all day looking at the casts and then left the beach, leaving the local police officers totally mystified, he had gone back to his room, and the first thing he did was get his revolver out from under his pillow, and he discovered that one bullet was missing, and he always kept his revolver fully loaded. And so he spent the rest of the night trying to convince himself that this was just one big coincidence. But the following morning, when he was given that bullet, he knew immediately that this was not a coincidence. The bullet that had killed Andre Monet was the same type of ammunition that he loaded his revolver with. And so he had to be the killer. He had effectively caught himself. The police were totally shocked and did not believe this at first. More specifically, they didn't want to believe that Robert, their star detective, was behind this horrible homicide. But eventually, after examining all the evidence, they agreed he had to be the killer. But to test whether this really was sleepwalking and not some elaborate cover-up by Robert, they decided to conduct an experiment. Robert, who was fully cooperative with the investigation, was told to sleep in this jail cell where he would be monitored 24/7 by armed guards, and in this cell with him would be a revolver loaded with blank rounds, and he was told to keep it under his pillow. For the first couple of days, nothing happened. Robert never touched the revolver during the day or when he was asleep. But about a week into this experiment, Robert suddenly woke up in the middle of the night in this trance-like state. He reached under his pillow, pulled out the revolver, and began firing at the guards right outside of the cell. And so this convinced the police that Robert had been telling the truth about what happened to Andre Monet. He really had killed him while he was sleepwalking. A decision was made not to prosecute Robert for the murder. Instead, they decided to basically exile him for everybody's protection. And so from then until 1937, when Robert died, he was forced to live alone on this secluded farm outside of Paris, where the only visitors he ever got were doctors who would only show up during the day and with armed bodyguards. In the early morning hours before sunrise on April 12, 1990, a 31-year-old man named Nathan Neesmith pushed down on the gas throttle of the fishing boat that he was steering just off the coast of Georgia. And as he did this, he expected the boat to naturally kind of kick into a higher gear and go faster. But as he pushed that throttle down, nothing really happened, and the boat just kind of sputtered along, going about half the speed that he expected it to go. Confused, Nathan stepped away and began making his way out towards the deck, where his younger brother, Billy Joe, who was actually the captain of this fishing boat, was out there taking a nap. And Nathan figured, if there was any issue with the boat, Billy Joe was the guy to talk to. He would know how to fix it. Now, for context, the two brothers were on the first day of a 7-day fishing trip that actually Nathan was not supposed to be a part of. The crew was originally going to be Billy Joe, the captain, and the one who actually rented the boat, along with Billy Joe's nephew, and also 2 other commercial fishermen. But at the last second, those 2 other commercial fishermen had bowed out, and Nathan and a friend had volunteered to go to round out the crew. Now, Nathan and Billy Joe, they came from a fishing family, but it was really only Billy Joe who had pursued the family business. Now, Nathan was perfectly handy out on the water and did know how to fish and knew his way around a fishing boat, but compared to Billy Joe, there was a massive gap in experience. Billy Joe was the fisherman, and Nathan really was not. But Nathan and Billy Joe were very close, and so as soon as Nathan heard Billy Joe was in trouble and needed some more fishermen, Nathan didn't hesitate to say he would do it. Because really, for their entire lives, that was sort of their dynamic. Even though Nathan was the older brother, it was Nathan who looked up to Billy Joe, and any chance he got, he would do anything to help Billy Joe. And Billy Joe really respected that and loved that about Nathan. But now, as Nathan made his way out to the deck to wake his brother up to tell him on the first day of the trip, right as Nathan's taking the wheel, that something's wrong with the boat and I can't fix it. And also, Nathan was enormous, like 250 pounds, well over 6 feet tall. He was huge, this big physical presence, but he really was not mechanically savvy at all. And so again, Nathan is sort of feeling like, sorry, and also maybe even second guessing whether or not it was even a good idea for him to have come along. If he can't even fix a minor issue with the throttle or the engine, what's he doing here? But when Nathan woke up his younger brother and explained the issue, Billy Joe was not upset. He was like, okay, we'll go down below and we'll take a look at the engine and make sure everything is okay. However, when they went down and Billy Joe opened up this hatch to look at the engine, smoke immediately came out, and it was very clear to Billy Joe anyways, that this was not like a minor issue. Something seriously was wrong with the engine. This was a big problem. And so Billy Joe began cussing, he's totally frustrated, and he just told Nathan to, go down below and tell the other two to wake up and come help. And so huge Nathan turned around and went down into the bunk room down below, and the second he got down to that level of the fishing boat, he just stopped, because there was at least a foot of water in the hallway and in the bunk room when he went inside. And so Nathan screamed at the other two fishermen to get up, and so they got up and they're looking down, they're seeing all this water, and so they're starting to panic. And Nathan, he goes back upstairs and he yells to Billy Joe, who's dealing with this engine issue, that in addition to that, it appears the boat is also sinking. And so Billy Joe is like, get buckets, go down there and start bailing out the water. I'm going to call Mayday. And so Billy Joe runs back up to the steering wheel. He grabs the radio, and Nathan and the others can hear him yelling over and over again, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And as that was happening, Nathan and the other two fishermen put on their life vests, grabbed buckets, and went down below to begin manually bailing out the water. But the second they got down there, it was very obvious the water, wherever it was leaking into the ship, was coming in way faster than they could potentially bail out. But they kept doing it, getting the water out as fast as they could, trying to stay calm. They can hear Billy getting more and more frantic, yelling Mayday over and over again. And then all the lights inside of the ship began to flicker, and then they went out, and they were cast into total darkness. The engine basically had stopped, and it was just silence, just the sound of water rushing into this boat. Also, Billy Joe had stopped yelling Mayday because clearly the boat had lost power and the radio didn't work. And unfortunately, before the power cut out, nobody had heard any of Billy Joe's Mayday calls. So nobody knew where they were, nobody knew they were sinking, and without power, they had no way to communicate to anybody. They were totally alone. So Nathan, Billy Joe, and the others did the only thing they could do. They went up to the main deck, they grabbed their inflatable life raft, they blew it up, chucked it over the side, they grabbed as many supplies as they could, put it in the raft, they all made sure they had all their flotation on, and then they jumped into the life raft, abandoning the sinking fishing boat. Now, once all four men were safely inside of this life raft, they were not as panicked as you might think they would be, because they had put enough food and water in this raft to last them at least several days. They all again had their life vests on, so proper flotation, and even though nobody responded to those Mayday calls, it wasn't impossible to think that maybe somebody had heard the Mayday calls and they just had not called back. Maybe there was a rescue operation coming to their location right now. They didn't know, but it felt plausible that they could be rescued. They would just need to kind of ration out their supplies and stay optimistic. However, their optimism quickly faded when, after only being in this life raft for 30 minutes, right as the sun was starting to come up, Nathan began to hear a strange sound. It was coming from somewhere in the life raft. He couldn't quite place the sound, and so at first he kind of tried to ignore it, but then he noticed the life raft was becoming softer, and then he realized the sound he heard was a small hiss. The raft had a leak. And even though the four men were able to trace the sound of this leak to the actual puncture, they didn't have a patch kit or any meaningful way to patch up this hole. And so all they could do was just put their hands over this leak and do their best to seal it. But it didn't stop the air from coming out. It just delayed it. And so over the next hour, again, as the sun is just coming up on the second day of their big fishing trip, the raft finally completely deflated, and all four men were suddenly bobbing in the freezing cold ocean, surrounded by the wreckage of their sinking fishing boat. And so eventually, the men grabbed the biggest piece of wood from the wreckage that came floating by, and it was buoyant enough that it kind of served as like a makeshift raft, but it wasn't buoyant enough to hold all 4 of them at once, which meant, they had to take turns resting on this raft, and then they'd have to get back in the ocean and kind of wait their turn again. I mean, totally miserable. And as this was happening, they just stared at the hull of their sinking fishing boat that was still poking up out of the ocean, just drift farther and farther away from them because the current was pretty strong. And as they watched their ship just kind of disappear into the distance, and they're just kind of drifting out into the middle of the ocean, they were all just stunned into silence. They could not believe how this had happened and so quickly. And also, what were they going to do? I mean, they're in the worst possible situation here. It just didn't seem possible that they could actually survive this. Now, for reference, even though the men had salvaged a lot of their food and water from the sinking life raft, and they had their flotation devices on, that didn't protect them from hypothermia. It wouldn't matter if it was super warm outside. What mattered is the ocean was really cold. And because they couldn't stay on that raft, they had to keep cycling through, going back in the ocean over and over again. It was just a matter of time before they would get hypothermia. And sometimes hypothermia can kick in just a couple of hours. I mean, we're not talking days here. This is going to be quick. And all these guys knew that. And so as these men were forced to have these really morbid discussions around who's going to stay in the water and who's going to stay on the raft, Nathan made a drastic decision. Nathan, being by far the biggest physically out of the 4 men, he knew that if he wasn't there right now, the other 3 could easily fit on their makeshift raft and stay out of the water, delaying hypothermia, thereby increasing the odds that they got rescued. And so Nathan did what he always did, and he turned to his younger brother, who he looked up to so much, who he just wanted to help all the time. And Nathan told him, I'm going to swim to the wreckage. I'm going to swim back to the hull of our sinking ship, and I'm going to fashion my own makeshift raft. That way you guys can have this one, and I'll have my own, and we can all get out of here in one piece. Now, keep in mind, it was fairly obvious that the hull of the sinking ship, which was barely visible near the horizon, was at least 3 miles away, just from their own rough calculations. So this is a monster swim to get to that. And so immediately, Billy Joe and the other 3 were like, no, that is a suicide mission. You cannot do that. Do not swim to the hull. You're not going to make it. Now, just to give some additional context here, if you're not familiar with just how challenging swimming in the open ocean is, I'm going to give you my limited experience. So when I was in the military, we had to do 1 5.5-mile open ocean swim. And then also we did a whole bunch of 2-mile ocean swims. And even though we were allowed to use amazing wetsuits and fins, we had a swim partner with us. We had the land nearby to use as a reference to make sure we're going the right direction. We had food, we had water, we were in great shape. Even with all of that, open ocean swims are miserable. You get all this salt in your mouth and your nose, you start cramping and chafing. I mean, it takes hours and hours and hours to swim some of these distances, and you're constantly fighting against the waves. I mean, it is an absolute chore swimming in the open ocean, again, even with all the right stuff in place. And you gotta remember, Nathan is this big guy, he's got this big bulky life vest on that's gonna make it hard to swim. He doesn't have fins, he doesn't have a wetsuit, and he's got no landmarks around him, to make sure he's going in a straight line. Typically when you're swimming in the ocean, you're constantly looking at the land or some other landmark to make sure you're going in the right direction. He wouldn't have had that. And also it's this unknown distance he's covering, and there could be predators in the water. I mean, there's so many barriers here that basically there was like a 0% chance this swim would be successful. But Nathan totally understood what he was really doing here. He didn't really know if he was actually going to make it to that boat. Frankly, that was not really the point. What he was really doing was choosing to sacrifice himself to potentially save his brother and the other 2. And so even though they were telling him, do not go, do not swim in that direction, you're not going to make it, Nathan just turned to his brother Billy Joe and said, I love you. And then he turned and began swimming. And by some miracle, 11 hours later, right as the sun was setting, Nathan was still alive and still swimming, and he did reach the sinking boat that still had its hull poking out of the water. Now, when Nathan got to the sinking ship, he was almost dead from dehydration, from hypothermia. I mean, he's miserable, but he's made it to his destination completely against all odds, and he climbed up onto this hull, and he found a spot on the hull of the ship that supported his weight, and he managed to tie himself using some rope or maybe his life vest to the hull, so he was anchored in place. And then he didn't get to sleep because the whole time he's thinking, this thing could sink under the water at any point and it will drag me with it because I'm tied to it, or he could just drift off of it if his rigging kind of came undone, if he was asleep. And so all night, beyond exhausted, he's just holding on to this hull, not really sure what's going to happen, but here he is, just waiting it out. And then finally, when the sun came up that next morning, as Nathan looked around him, he's in the middle of the ocean, he sees in the direction he had come from, this pillar of smoke coming up over the horizon. And so Nathan, he rubs his eyes. He can't believe it. He's thinking, there's no way. There's already a ship out here. We're in the middle of nowhere. But sure enough, slowly but surely, this massive freighter ship came into view that was very far away. It's not near Nathan, but he can see it clear as day. And where this ship was basically circling was roughly where he believed his brother and the other two fishermen were still floating. And so he's thinking, oh my goodness, the freighter is going to save them, and then it's going to come save me. And so Nathan just clung onto the hull and watched as this freighter made these big slow loops right around that same area. And then the freighter came to a full stop, and it appeared to lower something down into the water. It seemed very much like a full-blown rescue operation. And then about 3 hours after he first spotted this freighter, the freighter began to move again, and this time directly towards Nathan. Nathan was so relieved he could practically cry. But instead what he did is he thought, they're going to be here in a minute. I'm finally just going to close my eyes and go to sleep. And so he put his head down on the hull, looked one more time at the freighter, and then closed his eyes. Now, Nathan would be rescued, but it would not be by that huge freighter ship. Nathan eventually had opened his eyes after closing them for a second, and he saw this freighter that had been coming straight for him at some point had kind of deviated and gone in the wrong direction and then vanished over the horizon, never to be seen again. And it would take 3 more days before a separate ship happened to find Nathan. They scooped him up and they rescued him. But even though Nathan had been really crushed when that freighter had gone the wrong way, he held on to this idea that, that freighter had clearly rescued his brother and the other two fishermen. And certainly, even if they couldn't find him, they would go back and they would tell the authorities that Nathan is out there. He swam back to the hull of the ship. We got to go find him. And so certainly a rescue effort would be on the way. And it was true. A rescue boat had come out and found Nathan. So everything seemed to be tracking. And when Nathan woke up inside of his hospital room back on land, his friends and family were all by his bedside and he's looking around. He can't believe he survived. And the first thing he asks is, how's my brother? How are the other two fishermen? And why didn't that freighter pick me up too? And at this, all the people in the room just kind of looked at Nathan with a very confused look on their face. And eventually they asked him a question that made Nathan burst out in tears. They said, what freighter? It would turn out Billy Joe and the other two fishermen were still missing at this point, and nobody had heard a thing about some big freighter in the area. As far as anybody knew, at least in Nathan's family, that freighter ship did not exist. The search for Billy Joe and the remaining 2 crew members went on for weeks and weeks, and while the active search out on the ocean was going on, the Coast Guard and police were searching through every record they could possibly find of basically any ship that was even roughly in the area where Nathan and the others had been. But despite looking everywhere, there was basically no sign that any ship of any kind had been there beyond the rescue operation that eventually scooped up Nathan. And so again, it seemed very likely that that freighter ship didn't exist. And, it was possible that Nathan in his very deteriorated state had maybe hallucinated it. Although Nathan was adamant, he definitely saw that ship. It did not feel like, a multi-hour long hallucination. It felt like he was watching a ship. He was sure of it. But again, there was just no proof, and so nobody knew what to think of that. And then eventually, even though there was this huge search going on, there was just no sign of Billy Joe or the others. And so eventually the search was called off, and unfortunately, the presumption was Billy Joe and the other 2 were now dead. 5 months later, on the afternoon of October 5th, 1990, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home. Now, by this point, the victims' families had all tried to sort of restart their lives following this tragedy, but deep down, none of them could truly accept that Billy Joe and the other 2 fishermen were just gone. They just couldn't do it. It was too soon. It felt like, any moment they were going to get news that, they had been rescued by some freighter ship or something. And so anytime a phone rang in any of these families' homes, it's like they would rush to the phone with the sense of hope that this time it's going to be different. Their loved ones are going to be okay, only to obviously be crushed when that was not the case. But on this day, on October 5th, that phone call that came through in Nathan's sister's home, that one was different. When Nathan's mother picked up this phone call in Nathan's sister's home, she answered it and said hello, and right away she thought, oh, this has to be a wrong number, because the person who was calling was speaking in rapid Spanish, and she didn't understand what they were saying. But as she was about to hang up, the caller, intermittently throughout their rapid Spanish, began saying something in English that Nathan's mother could understand, and it totally shocked her. The caller kept saying Nathan's sister's name over and over again, followed by Nathan's sister's phone number, like on repeat, the name, the phone number in English over and over and over again. And Nathan's mom is so caught off guard by this that she just listened, not even sure what to do. And then before she could ask any follow-up questions, the caller cut the line and the phone call was over. And then a few minutes later, another phone rang in a home that was not far away from Nathan's sister's home. And this other home belonged to the boat owner who Billy Joe had rented the fishing boat from that unfortunately sank and caused this whole tragedy. And so this boat owner, he picks up the phone, he answers it, and just like the call that had come through in Nathan's sister's house, this call was the same. It was somebody calling, speaking rapid Spanish, and the boat owner was about to hang up when he heard something that he understood because it was in English. And what he heard was his own name followed by his phone number over and over and over again. Basically the same type of call that Nathan's mom had just heard. And then before the boat owner could ask any questions, the line went dead. Now, one phone call like this, you could chalk up to maybe a prank or a wrong number or just a really weird coincidence. But to have those two calls happen within minutes of each other and basically take on the exact same form, but different names and different phone numbers, it just seemed way too coincidental to not be somehow connected to the missing fisherman. Because the link between these two households where these calls came in was the doomed fishing trip. And these calls did not stop. Every few weeks after this first time these calls came through, the phone would ring in Nathan's sister's house or in the boat owner's house, and it would be the same thing all over again. Rapid Spanish followed by either Nathan's sister's name and then her phone number, or the boat owner's name and his phone number. Just like that for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so as soon as this started happening, Nathan's family and the boat owner, they figured out they were both getting these weird calls, and they contacted authorities, which kind of restarted the search for Billy Joe and the missing fisherman, because now it seemed very plausible that maybe Nathan really had seen a freighter, and that freighter really had picked up Billy Joe and the others, and maybe they had been taken to another country, a Spanish-speaking country, and maybe people were trying to get in touch with the families now to get them back home. Or, of course, there could be a negative side to this, that maybe they were captured by some rogue vessel and were being held by these people who were calling. I mean, there's any number of theories, but it made authorities wonder, hey, what's going on here? And so authorities got in touch with Mexican authorities and other Spanish-speaking country authorities and tried to figure out if there was any chance that there was, a vessel out there around the time that Billy Joe and the others were missing that in theory could have maybe illegally been in that area or something. But despite this kind of exhaustive effort to kind of look again to see if maybe there was a freighter in that area, there was just no evidence that there was. It made no sense, but the authorities said, look, we have no idea what these calls are about. We still do not think that freighter or any ship that even resembled a freighter was out there. We still believe that Billy Joe and the others are dead. But as for the victims' families, they just didn't buy that. They really believed that these strange phone calls were somehow connected to Billy Joe and the missing fisherman. Specifically, these calls must signal that Billy Joe and the others were still alive. They just had no evidence to support that. That is, until March 6th, 1991, so almost a year after the doomed fishing vessel sank and Billy Joe and the others went missing. On that day, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home, and she answered it, and it was the voice who spoke in rapid Spanish, but this time they spoke in perfect English, and all they said was, "I'm bringing him home." And then the line went dead. And Nathan's sister screamed and she yelled for her husband to call police. They contacted the authorities. And again, it kind of brought back to life the search for Billy Joe and the missing fisherman. And then after this call, there was a near constant presence of authorities on the Georgia coastline, basically looking out to the water, waiting, hoping for Billy Joe and the others to return. But unfortunately, they never did. And following that last phone call where the caller spoke in perfect English and said, "I'm bringing him home," after that, the call stopped. And so to this day, no one has ever been able to actually figure out what happened to Billy Joe and the other two fishermen. They are presumed dead at this point, but there's this one nagging question that surrounds the whole story, and that is, what did Nathan see? Was that actually a freighter picking up Billy Joe and the others? And if so, what did they do with them? Or was Nathan just hallucinating? It's entirely possible, but Nathan has always said he knows what he saw, and that was not a hallucination. As for the families of the victims, they still firmly believe that their loved ones are still out there, and someday they will come back home, and the families just hope they're alive long enough to be there for the reunion. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now.
But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
In December of 1990, a very concerned father was pacing around his kitchen, hoping that his daughter would call. But the phone stayed silent. And as it did, an anxious pit formed in his stomach. He was really worried about his daughter. He thought maybe she was in trouble. And also, he was worried that he himself might have accidentally just done something that could make things even worse. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please hack the Like Button's Facebook account and delete their date of birth so that nobody wishes them a happy birthday. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of Friday, December 7th, 1990, a 39-year-old woman named Janet Dennis set 4 dinner plates on the kitchen table at her home in a suburb of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. She had just finished making dinner for herself and her 3 kids, who at the current moment were watching a Christmas movie in the living room. Janet hummed along to the TV as she brought the food over to the table, and then she called her kids to come over and eat. The kids got up, they rushed over, they sat down, and as they began eating, Janet told them about all these fun holiday plans that she had made for them over winter break. So Janet really loved Christmas. She typically would decorate her house like the instant Thanksgiving was over. And earlier that same day, she had gone to a toy store and filled the entire backseat of her car with gifts for the kids. But Janet really wanted this Christmas to be especially memorable for her kids, because the past few months had been really tough on them. Back in July, Janet had divorced their father, Leroy, and so now the kids only saw their dad about once a week. Now, Janet knew the kids missed him terribly, but actually, Leroy had never really been a very present father, which was part of the reason that Janet had asked for the divorce in the first place. They'd been married for 16 years, and for most of that time, Janet had pretty much felt like she was just a single parent, on top of being the primary breadwinner for the family. And this was because Leroy owned and operated this ranch that was located about 90 miles away in a rural town called Sealing, and this ranch really had never made much money. And so Leroy had begun working all these crazy long hours to basically avoid hiring extra help, but because of that, he was usually gone before sunrise every single day, and he didn't get home until very, very late. So he's gone all the time working, but for not much return, not much money. And so for years, Janet had picked up the slack. She worked as a school nurse. That way she could, make some money. And then also she could be home to meet the kids after school every single day. And then when she was home, she managed the house by herself as well. And so that was ultimately really why a judge awarded her full custody of the kids back in July when the divorce was finalized. I mean, Leroy undeniably loved his kids, but he simply couldn't provide for them. And besides, at this point, he was now living on that ranch in Sealing, 90 miles away full time. And so, his kids' schools and social lives were here in Oklahoma City. It wasn't a match. And so now Janet put another serving of mashed potatoes on her plate. And as she did, she reminded her 12-year-old son, Tad, who was her oldest child, that he had a wrestling tournament at school in the morning and that they had to leave really early so they could get to the competition on time. After dinner, Tad helped his mom clear the table, and then they all went out to the living room to finish watching that Christmas movie together. And then when it was over, Janet followed her kids upstairs and helped get them all ready for bed. And then once they were all tucked in, she came back downstairs to finish cleaning up the kitchen. Now, this was about the time that Leroy, if they were still married, would be coming home from work. But now that Janet was divorced, she got to spend her evenings however she wanted. She thought about heading out to the garage to grab all those gifts she had purchased out of the car and bring them in to wrap them. But then, as she was about to head out, she saw a pair of headlights pull into her driveway. At 5:30 the next morning, Janet's 12-year-old son, Tad, shut off his alarm clock and rolled out of bed to get ready for his wrestling competition.
Once he had his stuff together, he went downstairs, expecting to find his mother in the kitchen already making breakfast. But he didn't see her in there. So he just went down the hallway to her bedroom, and he opened up her door and he looked in, and there was his mom, still lying in bed with the covers pulled all the way up over her head. So Tad, thinking this whole thing was a little bit odd because his mom was all over everything, he still called out for her to wake up because it was time to get ready to go. But his mom didn't move. And so he walked into the bedroom right next to the bed and pulled down the covers to shake her awake. But when he did that, he realized his mom is not in the bed at all. What he was looking at underneath the covers was actually a pile of pillows arranged to make it look like she was still sleeping in bed, which was really weird because to Tad, it now seemed pretty obvious that his mother had actually left the house, but for some reason, she seemed to want him to think that she was still home. And so just to make sure, Tad left the bedroom and ran to the garage to check. And sure enough, his mother's car was gone. And now Tad, he really didn't know what to do. Because in his entire life, his mother had never just left without telling him. And so Tad went back to the kitchen and he looked over at the clock on the oven and saw it was already 6 a.m., which meant he was already going to be late to his wrestling tournament. He wondered if maybe his mom had just run out to the gas station or something quick like that and she'd be home any minute. But a few more minutes passed by and she still didn't come home. And so at this point, Tad was becoming really anxious and he started to worry that his mom had maybe gotten into a car accident or something. So he did the only thing he could think of. He went over to the kitchen phone and he called his dad, who was out at the ranch in the ceiling. And when his dad picked up, he told him everything that was going on. Now, Leroy was, admittedly sort of confused by this whole thing, but he told his son, don't worry, your mom's going to be home any minute, I'm sure of it. But he also told him that just in case, he would start driving over to their house right now, just to make sure everything was okay. 2 hours later, Tad heard the sound of his father's truck pull into the driveway. And the instant he heard it, he jumped off the couch to go unlock the front door. When his dad walked into the house, the first thing he asked his son was, is Mom home? And Tad said, no, she's still not here. Leroy nodded, but reassured his son that, his mom was going to be home soon, that she would have a good explanation, it's okay. But, as Tad followed his father all around the house at this point, basically looking for Janet and looking for any sign of maybe where she had gone, Tad began to notice a look of concern growing on his father's face. And that sort of gave Tad this sick feeling in his stomach that maybe something's really wrong here. And then, sure enough, at some point, his dad, after searching the whole house and just sort of standing there for a moment, he turned to Tad and he said, we got to call the police. 2 days later, on Monday, December 10th, Lieutenant Detective Craig Gravel with the Oklahoma City Police District knocked on the door to Janet Dennis's house. He had spoken on the phone that morning to Janet's ex-husband Leroy, and now he heard Leroy's voice again, but from inside of the house right in front of him, calling to his kids to go on upstairs for a minute. And then a moment later, the door opened and Leroy invited Gravel inside. So even though it had been 2 days now since Leroy had called 911 and reported Janet missing, Gravel had only just been assigned to her case that morning. His captain had wanted to wait out the weekend before investigating formally because there had been no signs of violence at her home, and generally speaking, most adults who get reported missing show up within 48 hours. But that morning, when the case landed on Gravel's desk and he had begun reading over the details, his gut told him that something had happened to her. From all appearances, she was a very responsible and loving mother with no history of just disappearing like this. So Gravel had immediately put out an alert to all the police stations in the area to be on the lookout for Janet's car, which was a red Chevy Blazer. And then he had called Leroy and asked if they could speak. And so now Detective Gravel stepped inside of Janet's home, and right away he noticed how tidy and how covered in Christmas decorations it was. I mean, the whole house seemed so festive, which made Gravel think that Janet very likely had planned to be home for the holidays. And so he followed Leroy into the kitchen. They sat down at the table, and the first question he had for Leroy was, "Have you heard from Janet since we spoke this morning?" But Leroy said no. He said all he knew was that Janet had disappeared at some point between maybe 9 p.m. on Friday night when the kids went to bed, and they had seen her when they went to bed, and 6 a.m. the next morning when Tad had called him saying, "Mom's not here." And Leroy said, despite the fact that, Janet is his ex-wife and there wasn't a whole lot of love lost there, He said he was really worried because Janet would never just leave their kids alone. Never. However, he did tell the detective that while he had been just walking around the house for any clues about where she might have gone, he said he had noticed that her toiletries bag was gone. So now he didn't really know what to think. That sort of did suggest that maybe this was planned, but just very out of character. Gravel nodded and then asked Leroy could he think of any place that Janet might go to, maybe to go blow off steam or something, like some place if she was really stressed, where would she go? Leroy said, in the past, Janet had gone to Las Vegas to gamble, but again, she would never just go without warning and also would never just leave the kids unsupervised. Leroy said, at a minimum, she would have let him know if she was going away because, again, they have kids together. Even though they were divorced, they still basically were on decent terms. Gravel nodded and wrote down everything Leroy said. Now, to him, Leroy was definitely a suspect, but at this moment, he seemed to be cooperating. So Gravel wrapped up the interview and headed out because for right now, what he really wanted to do was go speak to another person who had also called the police station that weekend about Janet Dennis. Later that morning, so on Monday, December 10th, 1990, Detective Gravel pulled up to the home of Arthur Olson, who was Janet's father. Arthur had also called the station that weekend repeatedly to ask if any progress had been made on his daughter's case. When Arthur opened his door, he looked frazzled, and he asked if Gravel had found his daughter yet, or had any idea where she might be, or if she was okay. Gravel told Arthur that no, they still did not know where she was yet. However, he said that Leroy had told him that occasionally Janet would go to Las Vegas to gamble, to blow off steam. But Arthur echoed the same sentiment as Leroy when he brought this up, which is like, yeah, Janet would occasionally go to Las Vegas, but she would never do that without first making sure her kids were okay. She would never just leave in the middle of the night. That is not something she would do. And also, Arthur said, if she had gone to Vegas, like if that's where she was now, she wouldn't be alone. She would have gone with her new boyfriend. And when Arthur said this, that caught Gravel by surprise. Because Leroy, the ex-husband, had definitely not mentioned a new boyfriend. In fact, no boyfriends had been mentioned at all. And so Gravel asked Arthur to tell him more about this boyfriend, because this is the first he was hearing of him. At which point Arthur said, well, my daughter's actually been keeping this boyfriend a secret, both from Leroy and from the kids. Arthur said the guy's name was Jim Umbenhauer, and he was a soldier stationed at Fort Sill, which was an army base just a few towns over. But then this look of regret crossed Arthur's face. He told Gravel that he had actually only just met Jim for the first time this past weekend, after Janet was already missing. And the reason he met with him is he gave Jim a key to Janet's house. Gravel at this point looked up from his notepad and asked Arthur, what does that mean? Why did you do that? Now, Arthur went from looking regretful to looking straight up embarrassed as he explained. And he told Gravel that just a few hours after Janet was reported missing, Jim had actually called him, and Jim had told him that some of his belongings were actually at Janet's place, and that Janet would definitely not want Leroy to find those things because their relationship was a secret. So Jim had told Arthur that his plan was to wait until Leroy took the kids out somewhere, and then when the house was empty, he would sneak in using the key that he was asking Arthur for, and he would just grab up all his stuff. That way, Leroy wouldn't find it. Gravel, when he heard this, was shocked, because to him it was so obviously a bad idea for Arthur to have given Jim that key. Because as far as Gravel was concerned, Janet's house could be an active crime scene. But Arthur seemed to guess what Gravel was likely thinking here, because he said, he knew now that had been a mistake. But back on Saturday, he just didn't believe Janet was truly missing here. He expected her to come home. This couldn't be a big deal, right? But now he said he was absolutely sick with guilt. Shortly after this, Gravel wrapped up their interview, and then he hopped in his car, and he drove right back to the station. His top priority now was to track down the secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. But as soon as he got back to his desk, he learned there was actually a more pressing lead for him to follow up on. Janet's car had been located at the Oklahoma City airport. An hour later, Detective Gravel turned his car into the long-term parking garage at the Oklahoma City airport. He was there to follow up on a lead about Janet Dennis, who had disappeared from her house overnight on Friday, leaving her 3 young kids unattended. And right away, Gravel saw another police cruiser at the far end of the garage, parked behind a Chevy Blazer. Janet's Chevy Blazer. And so Gravel, he pulled up behind the other cruiser, and then he got out and just began walking around Janet's car, getting a look. And eventually he walked up and cupped his hands over his eyes so he could look through the window into the back seat. And when he looked in there, he saw it was completely full of new toys, which he assumed were Christmas presents for her kids. And when Gravel saw those presents, he instantly had a bad feeling in his stomach, like his gut was telling him that Janet did not drive her car to this location. Somebody else did. And also, at this point, Gravel also had proof that she wasn't in Las Vegas. So right before Gravel had come out to the airport, his team had called into this centralized database that could access all of the hotel reservations in the Las Vegas area, and there were no reservations anywhere in the entire city under Janet's name. Now, of course, she could be there with somebody else, maybe under their name, but this at least suggested, very strongly suggested, that she was not there. And so now, Gravel was confident that Janet had not skipped town for some spur-of-the-moment gambling trip. Now, at this point, if something had happened to Janet, well, Gravel's primary suspect at this point was Janet's new boyfriend, her secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. However, Gravel still had not looked into him yet, which meant if he was involved in any way in Janet's disappearance, well, by now, he could be anywhere. And so as Gravel is thinking about this, he was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. And he turned and he sees a car pull up right behind his cruiser. And then after they parked, this guy got out wearing a full army uniform, and he walked over to Gravel and he introduced himself as Jim Umbenhauer. Late that afternoon, Gravel sat in an interview room at the station across from Janet's secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer, and Jim was hooked up to a polygraph machine. So back at the airport, Jim had claimed that he'd been worried sick about Janet all weekend, and he'd been literally driving around town looking for her car. He claimed he had no idea that the car, or Detective Gravel, would be at the airport when he arrived. And it had just been like a total coincidence that he had just happened to find Janet's car at the exact moment police had found it. To Gravel, this felt like a fairly obvious lie, because the chances of Jim just running into Janet's car at the exact moment that police are finding it and that he's arriving to look at it, it just felt like not possible. And Gravel figured that Jim must have already known where Janet's car was and had somehow learned that the police had found it, and so he had just sort of shown up. Gravel knew it was actually common for killers and kidnappers to actually intentionally insert themselves into an ongoing investigation of their victims to influence the investigation or just keep a pulse on what's happening under the guise of being really helpful. And right away, Gravel had gotten the sense that Jim was doing just that. So Gravel had immediately asked Jim to not only come back to the station to talk, but to take a polygraph test. And Jim had agreed. And so now the polygraph examiner, so the person actually administering the polygraph, nodded to Gravel that they were ready to start. And so Gravel asked Jim, "Why did you ask for a key to sneak into Janet's house that past weekend?" Now, Jim looked genuinely surprised that Gravel even knew about that. But he told Gravel that he had simply gone over there to get a box of love letters from Janet's bedroom that were between he and Janet. He said that Janet had wanted to keep their relationship private, especially from Leroy. As a precaution, he had, asked Arthur to get the key to go in and get the letters. And he said, the letters were actually right now out in his car. Now, Gravel knew that would be easy enough to verify, so he just moved on. And he asked Jim, "Where were you on Friday night?" which was the last night that Janet's kids had seen her. And Jim actually said that he had been at Janet's house that night, which caught Gravel completely off guard. Jim explained that he had gone over to Janet's house after the kids had gone to sleep so that he and Janet could secretly spend some time together. Now, at this point, Gravel really had to just stop for a second and collect his thoughts before asking more questions, because he really had not seen this coming. I mean, all day he had been trying to place someone at Janet's house after 9 p.m. on that Friday. And now here was Jim admitting he had been there at the house on that Friday night after 9 p.m., making him the official last known person to have seen Janet. After a minute, Gravel told Jim to just go on, tell me more about your last time seeing Janet. And Jim explained that he had stayed at Janet's house for a few hours and he had left really late to drive back to Fort Sill. because he was actually supposed to deploy to Afghanistan the very next day, but when he got back to base that night, he learned that his deployment had actually been delayed for a few weeks. So Jim said the next day he had called Janet's house to tell her the good news, that they had a few more weeks together before he went overseas. But he said Janet didn't answer the phone. A family member had, and they had said that Janet was missing. Gravel just sat back in his chair, taking all this in. To him, it just seemed impossible that Jim would be the last person to see Janet before she just vanished, and then he also just so happened to find her car at the exact moment the police arrived to investigate. So Gravel began asking Jim more questions, predominantly about his personal life. And it was at that point that he learned that Janet was not Jim's only girlfriend. Right now, he was actually living with another woman in a town closer to Fort Sill. Now, Jim admitted that he knew this looked bad, but he swore that the relationship with this other woman wasn't working, and he really just wanted to be with Janet. But Gravel, at this point, felt like he had heard enough. I mean, this guy really had dug himself a hole. And so what he really wanted to do was just discuss the results of this polygraph test with the examiner in private. So he ended the interview and sent Jim home. And once Jim was gone, Gravel turned to the examiner, and the examiner said, "Yep, Jim failed his test," which meant he had been lying throughout the interview. And this was sort of unnerving for Gravel. I mean, because this guy that he had just interviewed very likely was the man responsible for Janet's disappearance. But Gravel knew that he would need more than polygraph results and sort of a gut feeling to arrest Jim and charge him with some sort of crime. Right now, he needed more evidence. A few days later, Detective Gravel was in his office pacing around, reading through some documents. So after his interview with Jim, Gravel had decided to go to the school where Janet worked to speak to her colleagues about her relationship with Jim. Now, he didn't even know if anybody at the school would know about her relationship at all because she had basically kept it secret. And so Gravel had been really surprised to learn that not only did everybody at the school seem to know about Jim, but when they talked about Jim, they spoke with huge adoration. I mean, they really loved Jim and thought that he was great for Janet. And on top of that, they all seemed to think, sort of collectively, that Leroy was a terrible husband and had been glad when Janet finally dumped him. They said Leroy was very argumentative and he was very controlling, and said the divorce had been really messy. And for Gravel, he found that kind of interesting because until that point, he had thought that Leroy and Janet were basically on good terms. But all of a sudden, it seemed like maybe that was not the case. So Gravel had gotten his hands on a copy of Janet and Leroy's divorce settlement, and those were the documents he was looking through. And as Gravel thumbed through it all, he saw that Leroy actually owed Janet a lot of money, $30,000 plus half of his ranch in Sealing. And that ranch, that was a really big deal because that was Leroy's entire livelihood. So to owe her half on top of the cash was like a huge deal. Plus, Gravel also knew that Janet had been given full custody of their kids. And so the way Gravel saw it, Leroy, he had a lot of reasons to be mad. And Gravel wondered if maybe he had been mad enough to do something to Janet. Just then, the phone on his desk rang and Gravel answered it. It was an undersheriff named Jerry Jones who worked in Dewey County, which is where Leroy's ranch was located. And he told Gravel that he had heard about Janet's disappearance and he wanted to help with the investigation in any way that he could. And he explained that right now there were lots of rumors sort of flying around Sealing that Leroy had killed Janet, and that one of Leroy's neighbors had spotted a big bonfire on Leroy's property just about at the same time that Janet had disappeared. The next day, Gravel was back in the interview room with the polygraph examiner, and this time Leroy was the one sitting across from the table from them, hooked up to the polygraph machine. Now, at first, Leroy definitely seemed nervous about taking this test, like he just seemed anxious. But as soon as they actually started, he quickly relaxed. It was almost like this was no big deal. Gravel began the interview by just asking him basic questions about his relationship with Janet and about their divorce. And Leroy would admit that he and Janet did fight a lot when they were married, and he said initially he had been very upset about owing Janet half of his ranch in Sealing. But he insisted that these days they were basically on good terms, and that he just really tried hard to focus on being a good father. And so not long after these sort of initial questions, Gravel asked Leroy to simply walk him through the night Janet disappeared. Like, tell me where you were, what you were doing. Leroy told Gravel that he had been at his mother's house that night, which was near his ranch in Sealing, and that the two of them just watched TV together and then they both went to sleep. This was the same story that Leroy had already given Gravel a few weeks ago when they first spoke, and Gravel had already called Leroy's mom and she had backed it up. Now, at this point, Gravel really wanted to ask Leroy about that bonfire that someone had spotted on his property. But he didn't want Leroy to know how suspicious of him he was. So Gravel decided that first he would check the polygraph tests so far to see whether Leroy had been truthful throughout the interview. So he asked Leroy to hang tight for a few minutes while he stepped out into the hallway and spoke to the examiner about his test results. Leroy was like, okay, great, yep, see you in a few minutes. But as he sat back down, Gravel could see he definitely looked anxious. And so Gravel, he went into the hallway and he walked over to the examiner, and the examiner told him that unfortunately, Leroy's results were inconclusive, which meant that he couldn't tell if Leroy was lying or telling the truth. And so feeling frustrated, Gravel went back into the room and just asked Leroy, hey, would you mind taking this test again? Leroy, he glanced at his watch and said no. He'd been there for 3 hours already and he had to get home to the kids, so no, he couldn't. He clarified to Gravel that he had actually moved the kids from Janet's house in Oklahoma City back to his ranch all the way out in Sealing because the daily commute had been too hard for him. And so now he had a long drive back home and he just wanted to get going. He also told Gravel that he had heart problems. And so part of him didn't want to take the test again simply because it was too stressful and he was worried about his heart. Now, Gravel thought that was a pretty strange excuse. I mean, the kids were one thing, but heart issues being the reason you can't take a polygraph, that just felt a little fishy. But at the same time, he couldn't force Leroy to stay at the station. Still, he didn't want to come out of this 3-hour polygraph session empty-handed, so Gravel asked Leroy to do one last thing before he left, to sign a consent to search form which would allow investigators to come out to Sealing and search his ranch. And to Gravel's relief, Leroy said, sure. The morning after Leroy took his polygraph test, Detective Gravel made the long drive from Oklahoma City to Sealing, where Leroy's ranch was located, and where Gravel hoped to find the, at this point, body of his missing person, Janet Dennis. The previous night, Gravel had placed a call to Undersheriff Jones, the officer from Dewey County who had volunteered to help with Janet's case. Gravel knew that Leroy's ranch was over 1,500 acres, so it's massive, and that it would likely take weeks to search the entire property. So Gravel had the Undersheriff's recon team actually begin that big search, while Gravel and his team began speaking to some of Leroy's neighbors. And so now, Gravel pulled up a long driveway and parked outside of a big farmhouse, and then after he stopped, he got out and walked up and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a middle-aged woman answered, and Gravel explained who he was, and that he had heard that one of Leroy's neighbors had seen a huge fire on Leroy's property around the time that Janet Dennis had disappeared. And this woman's eyes immediately went wide, and she said that she was the one who had seen the fire. And it had caught her attention because there was a ton of smoke, so it must have been huge. Gravel felt the surge of adrenaline because he had this feeling that this woman was likely about to lead him directly to Janet's body. She was going to show where this fire was. But then a guilty look came across her face, and she apologized to Gravel. And she said, after I had told some people about this fire, I learned that actually the fire I saw had occurred a few days before Janet went missing. And for Gravel, this was truly crushing. But, he asked the woman if she had spotted any other weird behavior on Leroy's ranch, but the woman just said no. And so Gravel ultimately thanked her for her time and then felt completely defeated as he walked back to his car. Gravel spent the next few hours going door to door in the area, asking more of Leroy's neighbors about the rumors flying around town that Leroy had killed Janet. But pretty much everybody said that those rumors were largely connected to the bonfire that actually happened a few days before Janet disappeared, which meant that by the time Gravel headed back to Oklahoma City, he had no actual proof that either Leroy or Jim had been involved in any way in Janet's disappearance. He really barely had any evidence at all that a crime had even occurred. And even though he strongly believed that Janet had been abducted and potentially killed, it was still technically possible that Janet disappeared by choice and was alive and well somewhere. And so at this point, Gravel was completely out of leads, and he would just have to wait to see what would turn up on the ranch at the end of this massive search of the 1,500 acres. 6 weeks later, in early February of 1991, Gravel answered the phone in his office, and the person on the other end of the line said that they had information about Janet Dennis. And this was fantastic news, because at this point, Gravel's investigation had completely stalled out. Nobody knew what happened to Janet. She had not turned up. It was basically dead end after dead end. And also, so far, the search of Leroy's property, which was still ongoing, had yet to turn up anything useful for this investigation. The only other recent development in the case had happened a few weeks ago when Leroy had contacted Gravel about a box of Jim's belongings that he had found at Janet's house. Now, by this point, Jim was no longer a secret. Leroy knew about the secret boyfriend. When Gravel looked inside this box, he found this VHS tape, and it was a pornography tape. Now, it was not like homemade. It was not Janet or Leroy or Jim or anybody. It was, real actors in this pornography tape, but it was a really specific type of pornography. It showed this woman being tied up and burned. Fictional, but that was the script. That's how the pornography went. When Gravel saw this, he wondered if this tape was actually why Jim had tried to get the key from Janet's father to sneak into Janet's house, if the real reason for that was actually to try to find this tape, this, torture porn, and get it out of the house. And so Gravel had actually brought Jim down to the station to question him about the pornography tape, but Jim swore up and down he had no idea where that video came from, and he had even taken another polygraph test, and this time he passed. And so now, Gravel really didn't know what to believe, and he was desperate for really any new information. And so this caller saying they knew something about Janet was like the only positive development in the case that he had seen in quite a while. And the caller said that they actually had remembered something that might be important. And that's when Gravel realized that he recognized the caller's voice. They had actually spoken before. Based on forensic evidence and witness testimony, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Janet Dennis on the night of December 7th, 1990. Late that night, the killer was standing inside of Janet's bedroom by the side of her bed, just watching her sleep. And as they stared at her sleeping, the killer was just filled with rage. Even though on the outside, the killer sort of projected a very affable nature and just was a very calm and very kind person, inside they loathed Janet. And one of the primary reasons they hated her so much is because of her recent decision-making. And so after standing there, just taking in the sight of like the object of their rage, they reached over and grabbed a rag they had soaked in chloroform, which is a chemical that when it's pushed up against your face, it can cause you to pass out if you breathe it in. And the killer, they put this rag right over Janet's mouth until she passed out, because they didn't want her waking up when they inevitably moved her. And then after using the chloroform, the killer grabbed Janet's purse and then also grabbed her toiletries to make it look like she had chosen to leave, to go on a trip somewhere. And then the killer actually lifted Janet up out of the bed, put her on the ground. Remember, she's passed out from this chemical. And then they put pillows in her bed under the sheets and kind of arranged them so at first glance it would look like Janet was still in bed with the covers up over her head. This really was just in case one of the kids came into the bedroom in the middle of the night, they would look and see their mom and they wouldn't think anything of it. And so now, with the pillows in place and with the purse and the toiletries in hand, the killer scooped Janet back up off the ground and then carried her out of the house. And once they were outside, the killer placed Janet's unconscious body in the back of the killer's vehicle, and then they drove her to a nearby house in Oklahoma City that they owned. The killer took Janet inside of this home and tied her up so that even if she woke up from this chloroform, she wouldn't be able to escape. And then the killer drove back to Janet's house, parked their vehicle there, and used Janet's keys they had gotten from her purse to get into her Chevy Blazer. And then they drove her Blazer out to the airport and parked it in the long-term parking lot. Then the killer took a taxi from the airport back to Janet's house, where they got into their own vehicle again and drove back to the house where Janet was tied up. Then the killer put Janet, who was still passed out, back into the killer's vehicle, and they drove her to another house they owned. This one was outside of Oklahoma City. And when they got to this house, the killer dragged Janet out of the back of their vehicle, they put her on the ground, and the killer went and got a shovel and then came back over and smashed her in the head with it until she was dead. And then once Janet was dead, the killer burned her body in the fire pit on their ranch. Janet's killer was her ex-husband Leroy, who just basically hated Janet for getting full custody of their kids, for getting half of his ranch, for him being ordered to pay her $30,000. Like, he hated her and resented her for all that. And then when he found out she was also dating this new guy, Jim, he was consumed by jealousy and decided he needed to do something, which was ultimately to murder his ex-wife. And then after the murder, he invented an alibi and reported Janet missing himself in order to cast suspicion off of himself. But he was ultimately caught because Leroy's neighbor remembered seeing smoke from his burn pit. It was the same neighbor that Gravel had spoken to. She had first thought the fire happened after Janet went missing, and then she changed her mind and thought it happened maybe before. But then a few weeks later, she checked her calendar and realized she had gotten the date wrong again, and that the fire was actually the day after Janet disappeared. And so she called Gravel right away and said, I have more information about Janet, and it might be important. And so later that same day, after getting this information, the search team out at the property, out at the ranch, focused their efforts on the burn pits, and they would eventually find Janet's remains. Leroy Dennis was convicted of first-degree murder and ultimately sentenced to life without parole. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we have 3 stories about people who each have like this one big thing in their life that brings them a lot of happiness and fulfillment and purpose. But unfortunately, this same thing winds up being the very reason that their life gets ruined. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, on the next really cold day, offer to make the like button a cup of hot cocoa. But don't use whipped cream on top, use shaving cream instead. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in June of 1993, a movie director named Xie Jin sat on a couch in a production studio in the city of Yinchuan, China. He was with a few members of his production team, and they were in the middle of auditioning what felt like the 100th terrible actor for the lead role in the film that he was directing. However, this was not an ordinary lead role. The lead role for this film was going to be a dog. So the movie was called An Old Man and His Dog, and it was based on this popular novel about a man living during a period of war in China with his loyal yellow dog. People had really responded to the story in the book because it captured just how devastating war could really be on rural communities. And a lot of people in China had seen themselves in the characters in this story. At this point, Jin had already cast the film's human actors, but the dog's role was by far the hardest to fill, and obviously the most central to the movie. He and his team had hosted a bunch of casting calls already and advertised to the public to ask if anybody had a dog that looked like the one that was in this book. And tons of people had answered this ad, but none of the dogs that they brought in were good enough for the film. And the reason for that is Jin knew, the dog needed to look the part, but it was more than that. Like, the dog also had to be compelling and charismatic despite being a dog. I mean, this dog was the hero of the story and the soul of the movie. So it really had to project loyalty and bravery and goodness on screen, and sort of come across also as gentle and sweet enough that audiences fell in love with it. But now, as Jin watched yet another anxious, poorly trained dog actor scurry around the room, he felt this wave of anxiety. Jin was starting to feel worried that, maybe the reason all these dog actors were not working out is because maybe the perfect dog just didn't exist. And if that was true, then his movie would not be good. Like, he would have a bad actor in the lead role and it would flop. And for Jin, that really represented sort of like a worst case scenario for him. So decades earlier, in the 1950s, Jin had been this prolific director in China, and he had won many prestigious awards. But during China's Cultural Revolution, which was a period of unrest in the country in the 1960s and 70s, Jin had been ostracized by the public because of his largely unpopular political views. And ever since then, he had been struggling to regain his status as a celebrated filmmaker. And so the chance to adapt this brilliant novel, which was touching and tragic and already beloved by the public, was like his opportunity to prove himself and get back on top. And he knew that, if the movie failed, he was old enough that he would very likely not get another chance like this, and he might be completely forgotten about. And so now, as this dog's audition came to an end, and obviously this dog was not going to be a fit, Jin's just sitting there feeling kind of hopeless, and Jin's producer walked up and led the anxious dog and its owner out of the room, and Jin at this point was so busy worrying to himself about how this movie was destined to fail now that he barely noticed his producer bringing in the next dog and owner. But when Jin looked up, and he actually looked at the dog that was now standing in front of him, the 101st audition he was seeing that day, he just stopped and practically gasped, because sitting in front of him, right in the middle of the room, was now this new dog that looked exactly like how he had pictured the one from the book. It was shaggy and big and yellow-haired and had this eager-to-please look in its eyes that made Jin instantly feel like he was connected to it. The owner who had come in with this dog was a young, friendly guy in his 30s who introduced himself as Chung, and he explained that he had just started a dog training and breeding company. And so having his dog cast in this movie would be a really big deal for his new business and would definitely help get his name out there. So this was like high stakes for him too. Now, Jin did not love the fact that, Chung had just begun this dog training and breeding business, so it meant that very likely he was pretty inexperienced with this dog actor. However, when the actual audition began, any worries Jin might have had completely vanished. Throughout the entire audition, Chung skillfully directed this dog like he'd been doing it for his whole life. And the dog was obviously really smart and followed all the commands. He was, really well trained. And it just seemed like the dog was really devoted to Chung, because it really did exactly what Chung asked every single time. But more than that, as Jin watched this audition, it really felt like this dog didn't just look the part, it acted the part. This was the dog he wanted in his movie. And so after only a few minutes, Jin stopped the audition and he told Chung, "You and your dog have got the job." They began filming the movie just a few days later, and basically as soon as they started, all the worries Jin had had about maybe this movie not doing so well just completely vanished. Because, just like he'd anticipated, this dog really was perfect. It obeyed his owner, Chung, without hesitation, same as it had during the audition. And the camera just loved this dog. The dog had this very sweet, tender quality to it that really came out anytime the actor playing the old man interacted with it, which is exactly what Jin had hoped for. And so Jin knew this dog was going to steal the hearts of everybody who saw it on screen. This was exactly what he wanted. And so Jin just disappeared into the making of this film. He poured all his focus, all his passion into each and every frame. And by the time production finally wrapped a few months later, Jin was sure they had just made a masterpiece. And Jin was right. The movie was released to rave reviews, and it seemed like everyone who saw it loved it. Not only was An Old Man and His Dog recognized as one of China's top films of the year, but also it was widely regarded as an instant classic worldwide. And so Jin knew that he had accomplished his goal here, and that his career now had a new beginning. A year and a half later, on an evening in late January of 1995, Jin was reading a script in his living room in the city of Shanghai, China. So the huge success of An Old Man and His Dog had meant that Jin was once again in very high demand, which meant he got lots of phone calls and people wanted him to read their scripts, and he was basically just getting to pick and choose what he wanted to do next. This was like best case scenario for him. So as Jin is sitting there, when his phone rang, because his phone again was ringing all the time these days, he assumed it had to be one of his producers who wanted to talk about one of the many scripts they were looking at. However, when Jin answered the phone, it was one of his producers, but what they said to him completely stunned Jin. His film, An Old Man and His Dog, apparently was being banned. Jin, when he heard this, he just sat there for a moment, unable to actually respond to this. This didn't make any sense. Why in the world would this wholesome movie about an old man and his dog get banned? This wasn't political in any way. This was a wholesome, family-friendly movie. So China did ban films with some regularity. Sometimes it was the content itself within the film could be viewed as being, unduly influential on the public in a negative way, and so that could cause the film to be banned. Or it could just be that the people who were in the film or the producers who made the film, they could have done something in their own personal lives that was viewed as being, unduly influential on the public, in a negative way. They could have had some scandal, and then because of that scandal, they could have their work banned. So the movie itself could be okay, but the people involved in the movie, they're bad, so movie must be bad as well. So that was sort of relatively normal. But Jin's film, An Old Man and His Dog, had been out for over a year at this point with no issues. It was viewed as this masterpiece. Everybody loved it. Everyone had all these great things to say about it. So it couldn't have been that. The movie itself clearly was okay. And Jin, he had in his former life, he had been politically divisive and it had cost him dearly, but that was in the past. He had not done anything political, not in this movie, not in his personal life now. He had not done anything that was scandalous that could potentially warrant, this film being banned. And so Jin's what in the world could have caused this movie to be banned? What is going on here? And his producer said, you're not going to believe it, but it's the dog. It would turn out, a few days before the producer called Jin, Chung, the owner of the dog who had starred in this film, had been arrested for being a serial killer. Over the last 5 years, he had murdered at least 5 people. But that was not actually why this movie was being scrutinized. The movie was being banned because of how Chung disposed of the bodies of the people he killed. After murdering and dismembering his victims, he would take those body parts and feed them to his dog, the star of the movie. And so ultimately, the Chinese government banned this film because they knew from now on, now that the news broke about Chung being a killer and what he did with the bodies, that you couldn't watch this movie and watch that dog without thinking about the fact that that dog was eating people. Jin would go on to make a few more movies, but they never really worked, and ultimately his career kind of stalled, and he never reached the heights that he had hoped for. However, Jin had always hoped that one day he would leave a truly lasting mark on the Chinese film industry. And he did, because he'll always be known for casting a flesh-eating dog in his cinematic masterpiece. One evening in December of 1966, an 8-year-old girl named Elaine Ellery hurried after her parents as they walked towards this large factory in Norfolk, England. Elaine was so excited about the night ahead here that she was literally skipping as she walked along. So this factory was where her father worked, and they were having their big annual Christmas party. And for the first time ever, Elaine was being allowed to go, and she couldn't wait to see what was inside. So Elaine was really close with her dad, because even though he worked very long hours, he always went out of his way to spend time with her and make her feel very special. In fact, during the work week, it wasn't uncommon for her dad to come home over his lunch break just to give his daughter a big hug, and so they could quickly eat together before he had to rush back to work. And so now, after hearing about her dad's amazing factory over countless lunches they spent together, Elaine, for the first time ever, was actually going to be able to see what he was talking about, because to this point, she had never even stepped foot inside of the factory. Finally, Elaine and her parents arrived in front of this big factory, and in the doors they went, and immediately Elaine is totally struck by just how truly incredible this place is. I mean, it was huge inside. It was already packed with people who were chatting about. There were all these other coworkers and their kids and their families, and Christmas music was playing and all she could smell was apple cider and baked goods. And she looked around and she saw the whole interior of this great entry room they had walked into was beautifully decorated for the holidays. There was tinsel and there were all these things hung up everywhere, and there was even fake snow all over the place to give it like a true Christmas vibe. And so Elaine, I mean, she had really high expectations of how grand this place was going to be, and so far, it had more than lived up to its expectations. I mean, this was really like an incredible thing. So she was delighted, and the whole night she just ran around the party holding her dad's hand, looking at the machines and meeting his coworkers and eating all these treats. I mean, it was really just an incredible time. I mean, the evening was a whirlwind for her, and before she knew it, Elaine was exhausted and back in the car, driving home, drifting off into a very happy sleep. The rest of Elaine's childhood was very charmed. I mean, basically, she and her dad stayed very close. You know, they went to that Christmas party every year after that first time she went, and it was always such a fun event. And Elaine and her dad continued to have those lunch breaks during the work week. And, you know, by the time Elaine was getting old enough to start thinking about, you know, starting a family of her own, she thought hard about the values that her father had instilled in her. One was her dad clearly worked very, very hard. And the second one was her father clearly prioritized family over everything else. You know, as inconvenient as it was for him to come home on his lunch break practically every day, you know, taking a break from, you know, backbreaking work in the factory, he still did it because he wanted his daughter to feel prioritized and special. And so she knew when she had a family of her own, she would act like her father. So you can imagine how Elaine felt in 1983 when Elaine was 25 years old, and by this point, she'd gotten married, she had 2 kids of her own, she was living up to the example her father had set for her. You can imagine how she felt when that year her father passed away. I mean, for Elaine, this was like earth-shattering. I mean, she knew he was getting older, and it wasn't wholly unexpected that he passed, but for Elaine, I mean, this truly was like devastating. I mean, her father was like her rock. She had really modeled her whole life on her dad. However, after that initial really intense grief period ended right after the death of her father, Elaine was able to, you know, have a moment of reflection, and she realized that, you know, as devastating as it was that he was gone now, you know, in a way, because of the way she had built her life, prioritizing family and, you know, living like her dad, that in some ways, even though he was gone physically, spiritually, he was very much still with her and always would be. Fast forward 41 years to one afternoon late in the summer of 2024. And Elaine, who was now in her late 60s, was sitting at her kitchen table in her Norfolk home reading the newspaper. So Elaine had retired just a few years ago. And so now her life was pretty much exclusively about her family and about, you know, slowing down and truly being retired. And in some ways, the timing couldn't have been better for her to start slowing down because lately, Elaine had been feeling absolutely exhausted, which was odd because Elaine felt like, you know, even though she viewed her retirement as a chance to slow down, that she would likely have more energy because she wasn't working anymore. And so her slowing down would sort of be by choice, not because she literally couldn't keep up anymore. But lately, it was like Elaine had zero energy. It's like all she could do was sit in place and either read or call her kids, and that was basically it. But on this particular day, as Elaine just sat in the kitchen reading the newspaper, despite not physically really doing much at all, she suddenly started to feel winded, like she had been running around or something, like it was hard to catch her breath, and it scared her. She put the paper down and she sat there for a minute trying to calm herself down, telling herself this is just like a panic attack or something. But it didn't go away, and she really was struggling to breathe. And so she decided she would get up and go get a cup of water and just, you know, take a sip of water and calm down. But when she stood up and began walking over to the sink to get water, like this sensation she was having just got worse and worse. And by the time she was at the counter, she's like holding on to it just to stay up on her feet, and she's trying to sip the water, but she's still like unable to breathe. And she realized that this, combined with this, you know, recent really intense fatigue, meant something had to be wrong here. Like this was not something she could just write off. And so she hobbled her way over to the phone, she picked it up, and she called her doctor. Not long after, one of Elaine's children came by, picked her up, and drove her to the hospital. And by this point, Elaine, she had calmed down a little bit, but still that experience of really not being able to breathe really had shaken her up. And so Elaine, she goes into the doctor's office and She sits down in the exam room and she explains to her doctor what's been going on and what just happened that day. And not long after that, her doctor got a series of tests done, and eventually Elaine got an answer from those tests that explained all of her symptoms. However, that answer made Elaine look at her childhood, her charmed childhood, in a completely new and disturbing way. It would turn out, decades earlier, Elaine's father really had been setting a great example by working very hard and always prioritizing his family and always prioritizing his daughter. But what her father didn't know at the time, in fact, many people didn't know at the time, was that his work itself was actually putting his family at risk. At this time in the UK, most factories, like the one Elaine's father worked at, made products that contained asbestos. So asbestos is a substance that was used very widely for decades to construct structures primarily. Like in construction, it was used a lot. In fact, it was so common that basically any house or building built before the year 2000 likely was made with asbestos inside of it. And so when Elaine was growing up in the 1960s, asbestos was, naturally still being used all the time, and her father obviously encountered it daily at his work. But even though they didn't know it at the time, this was a huge problem for Elaine and her family, and really for anybody else who was living a life that was similar to theirs. Because asbestos was eventually found to be highly toxic and known to cause a very specific type of very aggressive and very deadly cancer that can sometimes take decades to develop. It was the very kind of cancer that Elaine's father had died from in the 1980s. And unfortunately, it was the very kind of cancer that Elaine was diagnosed with in 2024 following that, difficulty breathing and fatigue spell. And then she would eventually die a year later in 2025 from that cancer. And so in a tragic twist of fate here, basically it was because of how close Elaine was with her father growing up that she ultimately contracted the same disease that he did. I mean, there's no question he got that cancer because of his exposure to asbestos in the factory. But he would come home from the factory, like over lunch, he'd come home and he'd have lunch with Elaine and he wouldn't change. He'd give her a big hug. They'd have their lunch break together. He's putting asbestos on his daughter, not knowingly, but he's covering her in this toxic substance. And then when he would bring her to the Christmas party, all that white snow on the ground was not snow, it was asbestos, but they didn't know it was toxic. And so ultimately, it really was because of how much she loved her dad and how much he loved her that ultimately killed them both. Around 9 p.m. on January 18, 2015, a 68-year-old man named Dennis Antiporak stood at his kitchen counter in North Miami Beach, Florida, writing a note. And this note was for his wife and for his adult daughter, Laura, who lived with them. And all he was doing was letting them know that he was going to be stepping out, but he'd be back in a couple of hours. Now, for Dennis, it actually was not that unusual for him to go out this late at night. This was kind of routine. He would often leave the condo where they lived and he would go down the street to this diner called Denny's, which is a big chain in America. And he would hang out there with his friends, stay there for a couple of hours, and then he'd come back home. And tonight was going to be no different. His plan, as he said in this letter, was to go to Denny's. However, there was one stop he wanted to make before he headed out to Denny's, and he made that clear in his note. He basically provided his loved ones with his evening itinerary. So after finishing the note, Dennis left it on the counter, he grabbed his things, and then he walked out the front door of the condo. Several hours later, around 2 a.m., Dennis's daughter, Laura, paced around the living room of the family's condo with her cell phone to her ear. So she and her mother had gotten home around 10, so an hour after Dennis had left, and they had found Dennis's note on the kitchen island. But now, it was getting really late, and from the note, it seemed an awful lot like he would have been back by now. And so now Laura was trying to call her dad to figure out what was going on. However, every time Laura dialed her dad's number, it just went straight to voicemail. And so again, now that it's like 2 a.m. and she's starting to worry about her dad, she knew that he had gone to Denny's, the diner down the road. And so she looked up the number for that restaurant. It was open 24/7. And she called the Denny's. However, when a worker at Denny's answered the phone and Laura asked them, hey, is my dad there? Because by this point they would know him. He went there all the time. The worker said no. He hadn't been in at all the whole night. And so after hearing this, Laura was baffled. Like, where else could her dad be? But then she remembered the note, because her dad said before he was going to go to Denny's, he was going to make a pit stop. And so she looked at the note again, and she was like, that's where he has to be. He's got to be upstairs. So upstairs in this condo complex was a whole bunch of amenities that this place offered for its residents. There was a big gym and a pool, and there were common areas and relaxation rooms and all these different things up there. And Dennis loved going up there. And in his note, he indicated that's where he was going to go and go relax for a little bit before going out to Denny's. And so Laura, she heads upstairs, and the first place she looks is the gym. But the gym was totally empty. No one's up there working out at 2 in the morning. It was vacant, and her dad's nowhere to be found. And then from the gym, she went to the pool area, and the pool was closed, but she could look into the pool area itself, and there was no one in there, including her dad. He was not in the pool. But then Laura looked from the pool over to this door that was near the pool area that led to one of those relaxation rooms that this condo offered its residents. And in her dad's note, he had indicated he was going up there to, relax. And so she walked over to the door, she tried the handle, it was unlocked, she pushed it open, and immediately she was hit with this overwhelming smell. She nearly gagged, and then she looked up and she saw her dad. So this condo had a whole bunch of different ways for their residents to unwind and relax. They had these relaxation rooms. They had mindfulness rooms and meditation rooms and yoga rooms. They had the pool, they had the gym, and they had Dennis's favorite relaxation room, which was actually just a sauna. So earlier that night, Dennis went into the sauna, expecting to be in there for a short amount of time to just relax, basically. A sauna, all it is just a closed space that gets really, really hot inside, and you sweat, and you just kind of sit there and just allow your body to kind of melt a little bit and relax, and then you get out again, you feel very refreshed. But it's critical that you only stay in for a limited amount of time, because you're effectively inside of an oven. And Dennis, he went into the sauna, no one else is in there, he set the timer for when it should shut off, and he fell asleep inside the sauna. And then the timer malfunctioned, and so the sauna didn't turn off. And so he's asleep in the sauna, it's just cooking him over and over again until he actually has a heat-induced heart attack and he dies. But then nobody knew he was in there, and the sauna's still on, and so he's dead in the sauna, basically just cooking for hours and hours and hours, until finally his daughter Laura went up there, opened up the sauna door, and found her dad, who by this point was literally charbroiled. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.